All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for being with us. And on Atlanta News First Plus, I'm Joy Limnacker, and joined today by Professor Jonathan Nash from Emory University School of Law. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, we brought you in today because it's a big news day on legal news in particular. It is the 1 year anniversary of the indictment of former President Donald Trump here in the Fulton County election interference case led by Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. And, this has become even more important as Mr. Trump prepares, for the upcoming election. And we were just showing some video of Kamala Harris, his opponent, as well. A year later, it really not so much has happened, and yet the case has really not moved forward. Kind of backing up on what's happened so far, about a year ago today, 18 defendants were charged in the massive election interference case. Since then, 4 of them had pleaded guilty, but the case is kind of stuck, right?
That's exactly right. I think thinking back to a year ago, maybe people thought that the indictment itself would derail former President Trump's bid to return as the Republican nominee, but that hasn't happened. So the case is out there. It's stalled. You have the Georgia Court of Appeals sitting on an appeal to decide whether or not DA Fani Willis should be allowed to remain as a prosecutor on the case. And until that's resolved, we're probably just going to be in this holding pattern.
Yeah. So that issue, like you say, I mean, that was something that was unforeseen, right? And I would
So.
argue even unforeseeable unless you had maybe some inside knowledge.
Yeah.
But we talked about the possibility of Miss Willis being removed from the case. How likely is that? And if it does happen, how would that impact the case?
Well, it's hard to say how likely it is. Certainly, the trial judge's opinion when he said that either Nathan Wade or Fani Willis had to go sort of suggested that there was, I forgot the exact language, an air of mendacity, questions about people being forthcoming, which could give the appellate court some ground to remove Fani Willis. And there are questions about exactly how she'd be able to move forward. But it's possible that the appellate court leaves her there. If she were to leave, then you're faced with a situation where a new prosecutor from somewhere comes in, takes over the case, and that opens up a new can of worms. Would that prosecutor want to keep the case? Would that prosecutor want to drop the case? Potentially, we're talking on the timeline. At that point, perhaps former President Trump is once again President Trump. How does that play out? So there's a lot of questions here.
Yeah, absolutely. You have also pointed out to me, off camera, that a recent development which the media largely ignored concerns Mark Meadows' petition for certiorari with the Supreme Court, which was filed last month. What does that mean? What's the significance?
So almost a year ago, Mark Meadows, chief of staff under former President Trump, filed a petition, papers to remove his prosecution from state court to federal court. It would still be prosecuted by state prosecutors, but it would take place in federal court. That was denied by the federal district court and then the federal appellate court. He now has renewed that application with the U.S. Supreme Court, and he cited the recent Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity that was handed down in June. So the Supreme Court is looking at that, even while the Georgia Court of Appeals is looking at whether or not Fani Willis should stay on the case. And if the Supreme Court were to grant that case and hear that appeal, potentially, if the case moves forward, so that's an if, it's possible that Mark Meadows' particular prosecution could wind up proceeding, depending on how the Supreme Court ruled, in federal court rather than state court. So it's like a multi-headed monster where there's so many things going on at the same time.
Yeah, and apologize because sometimes I get distracted with trying to manage the video as well. But there's also a notice of a claim that Mr. Trump's attorneys just filed, you said, against the Justice Department with regard to the raid of his Mar-a-Lago home.
Yes, so that has to do with another case pending against the former president, the one in Florida. That's a federal case now being maintained by a special prosecutor under the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, and this has to do with the raid on his home. You'll remember that he allegedly had classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, and he has filed papers necessary as a precursor to filing a lawsuit for damages against the federal government for violating his rights. I don't think that case is necessarily has a lot of merit behind it, but he's arguing that the FBI didn't consult with his attorneys properly beforehand, and that the special prosecutor in the case was not properly appointed, which is something that a federal judge in Florida recently said was in fact the case.
That's right. That's right. And and so when we're looking at what happened here in Fulton County, it was actually the fourth indictment against the former president, because or set of indictments, because but in that context, I mean, what does it mean in terms of kind of the priority of the court scheduling here? Because you've got these three other cases.
Well, court scheduling was an issue, has been an issue all along. And you remember there were questions about when the president could be in one court as opposed to another court. They were trying to schedule things. On top of that, of course, now he's campaigning, which is another problem or issue as far as scheduling. And if he becomes president, at that point, you would think that all the prosecutions would at least have to be put on hold. The federal prosecutions, I think conceivably he could pardon himself. That's not the case for the state prosecutions, however. There's as I said before, there's just a lot of moving pieces here, and the fact that the Georgia case is in abeyance, I guess, for the next few months probably takes us, again, to a point where either he is at least the new president-elect or he loses the election. And at that point, we'll have to see how things play out.
Yeah. Any final thoughts on this?
Well, I would only say it's been a year. It's been a year that I don't think anybody expected. Certainly, indicting a former president itself was something novel, so it was hard to know how that would go. I think everybody understood that it was new territory, but I don't think anybody saw all the ins and outs and turns and things that have taken place in this case. It's really remarkable. It's something to watch. It's riveting, and who knows what the next year will bring.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that happened over the past year was also the Supreme Court ruling regarding presidential immunity, where essentially they stated that a president has some level of immunity for official acts done, in basically in their capacity in office. Does that have any bearing at all on what's happening here in Fulton County?
It could. So some of the acts that are alleged in the indictment for President Trump could arguably be said to be official acts. On top of that, the Supreme Court also said, even for unofficial acts, something that the president can be prosecuted for, prosecutors can't make use of official acts as evidence in trying to get a conviction for an unofficial act. So even if the charges can move forward, I think the prosecutors, whoever's prosecuting this case, if they move forward, will have to think about what evidence will be available to them after the Supreme Court's ruling.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Emory University School of Law professor Jonathan Nash joining us. We really appreciate your expertise and analysis.
Thank you so much.